Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be going through some book and reading trends from 2025. Over on my community tab, I had asked all of you what are some trends from this last year that you would love to see die, and then what are some trends that you would like to see expanded upon or continued into 2026. So for today we're going to be going through your answers to that prompt. Sometimes when I do this style of video, it is a little bit more of a reaction where it's more off the cuff and I'm just looking through them in real time. But for today, I figured there would be certain trends that got hit upon multiple times. So I wanted to ensure that I kind of filtered through and ensured I got the ones that were mentioned the most, but that also ones that maybe were a little bit more in the weeds that weren't talked about as often. I wanted to make sure I pulled some of those as well. That way we go through a fuller range of topics for today. And there are a lot of different topics to get through, so we're probably going to be in for a little while if you need to get a snack or a beverage or something like that, because this is going to probably take a little bit to ensure that we actually get through not just a lot of the responses, but that we take the time to actually discuss a lot of what's said. Before I jump into it, this has nothing to do with trends. This is just kind of a fun little aside that I would love to get your suggestions for. This year, I'm starting what I'm calling a long distance library with my nieces because they live in a different state from me, but they're of an age where I can start recommending books to them and they do like to read. One of them is 11 and they really like manga, and the other one is 13 and they read a mix of different genres currently, but I have sent them a few things currently, but if you have any kiddos in your lives that are roughly that age, it doesn't have to just be fantasy, but what are some books or series that the kids in your lives really, really love? Because I have certain books that I would like to recommend them, but also I don't read as much middle grade and YA these days, so if you have your own suggestions, let me know, because this is really exciting and fun for me because they're really lovely and they're funny and quirky, and I'm just excited to bond with them over books, and I want to give them good recommendations. So if you have any recommendations of books that the young people are loving these days, let me know. But anyway, now officially getting into trends from 2025 that we would like to see die and ones we would like to see stay. This first one was not only a concept that was presented multiple times, but I saw this one comment alone had 130 likes, so this is definitely something a lot of you are in agreement about. It says, maybe an unpopular opinion, but I'd like to see less published fan fiction that's marketed as published fan fiction. So this could mean a couple of different things, and there is also kind of a offshoot of this that I'll make sure we dive into as well. So Lisa, the person who submitted this, I'm not entirely sure if your main gripe is in the way it's marketed or if your gripe is with fan fiction being published. The idea, though, of fan fiction being published was something that I saw. That is the offshoot I'm referencing, so I want to make sure I address that. And then also I want to make sure I address the idea of, even if you're not in complete opposition to fan fiction eventually finding its way to being traditionally published, but you are just frustrated when it continues to be marketed based off of the original inspiration, that idea, I'll make sure I address that as well, which I think is more so, Lisa, what you're referring to. I'll start with the fan fiction topic in general. I did an entire video dedicated to this quite a while ago because I know that I held a lot of misconceptions about this before I looked further into it, and I do still see a lot of misconceptions about this. So if you want more in-depth thoughts, that video goes into them, but I'm going to kind of briefly summarize some of the reasons why we're seeing a shift in how things are approached. There are websites where people have a full awareness, the writers of these fan fiction stories, they have a full awareness that what they're doing is purely for the love of the original source material. They just want to contribute to the fandom, and they do not want to profit because they fully recognize that what they're doing is just for fun or for a practice in writing or bonding with other people within the fandom. They don't actually want to profit whatsoever. They write these stories, they connect with other people over their fan fiction, and it's just a fun little community where people are bonding together. However, sometimes there are individuals who are printing off these stories and they are making fan bindings and then they're selling those. So the original creator of the story is not making any money. The person who wrote their own version of the story, they're not making any money. And they also are aware that they shouldn't be making money. But then there's this other person that did the least amount of work, and they are making money. And it's starting to become, I'm going to sound very dramatic for a second, but like an underground black market of fan fiction, you could say. And I think there was even a word for it. There was like, it was marketed as like a gift or things like that. And I think it was sold on sites like Etsy or eBay or things like that. And it's really hard to monitor because it's not like when somebody is uploading merch, for example, and the merch clearly has quotes from some work that is copyrighted, and so it's easier to find it and take it down. It's not as easy to do because it's almost like a person-to-person basis, and people are profiting off of it. And this was becoming a big enough problem where there were some individuals that were wondering, how can we ensure that this isn't happening as much? So some of what has occurred is that some fan fiction stories, while they had their roots in, of course, a sort of what-if scenario, like let's say, for example, this is a big one, that there's two characters that I won't say in case you've not watched Avatar: The Last Airbender, but there are two characters that people are like, oh, I would have liked it if they ended up together. So there's fan fiction that exists of those characters ending up together. And if somebody writes that, and that was the original idea of what if these two characters ended up together, and then they write some story that ultimately doesn't actually feel that similar to Avatar: The Last Airbender, it just had its roots in that concept, the end result of what they're writing, it's probably still going to have the names of the characters, of course, and it's probably still going to have the names of places, it's going to have the same rules for the magic system, but the actual story beats and other such things are different enough where it genuinely doesn't necessarily feel like it's exactly rooted in Avatar: The Last Airbender. But because there are those people that are doing those fan printings, it's becoming pretty difficult to regulate these sorts of things. So as a result, some of what's happened is that there are stories that people really, really love that are on these fanfiction websites, but that the creators feel obligated to take down because there are too many people that are profiting off of someone else's work that the creator of this fanfiction never wanted to have happen. So they'll take these stories down, but then there are people that really loved these stories, and the stories themselves, while they might have had their original inspirations in characters and places and magic systems from someone else's world, sometimes they do take on a life of their own, and they become enough of their own story that it could stand on its own if it was reworked enough. So what will happen sometimes is that people will decide to take their work down. If they're approached by a traditional publisher, the publisher will work with them, or they're supposed to if they're going to go down this path. They'll work with them to make sure that it isn't too closely related to the original work, that it truly is its own story, and then they will then publish that story so that the original creator doesn't have this sort of trickled down means of having somebody profit off of their work. And also the person who originally took inspiration and love from this, but then worked really hard to write their own story, they can profit, and you try to eliminate all of the unfair profiting off of copyrighted work. There are a number of things to note, though, about this. First off, I do think that it is very important to always ask, how similar is the work now? Is it still too similar? Because there have been times where I have read works that weren't even marketed as fan fiction that eventually became traditionally published. I have read works before where I couldn't give it, I actually couldn't even recommend the book because it was so similar, and I kind of took issue with that. So that has occurred, and interestingly, that hasn't ever occurred in the books that are marketed as fan fiction to traditionally published, though I haven't read that many, so, take that with a grain of salt. But I have seen works that are too similar, and I can't really get on board with it. Also, I do think there is something to us being kind of cued for noticing similarities when we know that it had its roots in fan fiction, because there are other books that people think are really quite similar, but they don't hold too strongly to the criticisms because ultimately it didn't start off as fan fiction. So an example that is something a lot of you I think will know about, and this has been said by many people, not just me, but The Will of the Many, a lot of people have noted, is very similar to Red Rising. So the amount of similarities, if you were to line them up, it might actually have more similarities than something that originally was a fan fiction and became its own story to whatever the original story was. But are we like I said, queued up to just be more hyper fixated on the similarities than we would be for something like The Will of the Many and Red Rising. So that's a question we have to ask ourselves, both of those things. If it's too similar or if we are being hypercritical because of the way it's marketed. Those are both questions that we have to ask ourselves. And I don't think we should be afraid to state when we think it is too similar. This now leads into what Lisa was saying about things that are originally fan fiction. They supposedly get reworked enough that they have now transformed into something else. But yet the publisher keeps marketing it as fan fiction. And I know the main one that most people can draw from is the Dramini fan fiction works. Because the marketing is making the characters on the covers, on artwork they've commissioned, on all of the images that they're putting out to all of us, they are clearly showing those characters to look like how the characters from Harry Potter looked. And it's really frustrating for the authors, I'm sure, because the authors are like, you just told me to, as much as possible, eradicate the similarities and to make sure that this book stands on its own, whichever one you're referring to, because in this particular example, there are more than a few. So the authors are doing everything they can, only for marketing to turn around and be like, but what if we use the original to market your book? And it's like, okay, that feels like it's so beside the point. So I'm very much with you, Lisa, on being frustrated with this. And that other part of the equation I was talking about before of, are we making readers a little bit more ready to be like, let me put my spectacles on and examine this? I think sometimes we are. And I'd like to believe most of us are able to check the bias that we may or may not have, but sometimes there are things that we just don't even realize are kind of seeping into us and our way of thinking about something. All of that said, I think there is also the question of how much authors should be even using their inspiration from something else to begin their writing careers. And this is the part where I feel like this is really difficult to dictate and supervise, because almost every author, whether they started when they were young or started later, was inspired by someone else's work to some degree. And maybe it didn't start as an official, oh, what if these characters from Avatar: The Last Airbender, what if they actually ended up together instead of these characters? While it might not have its origin, whatever story an author first starts writing, while their original story might not be that directly related to something else, certainly a lot of authors are openly discussing the works that have inspired them, and then you can see traces of it in their own stories. But do we try to hold authors to the origin of their inspiration when we're having reviews or discussions about these works, or do we completely base our ideas off of the final product? For me, that's kind of where I lie. Whatever your original origin was for your inspiration for a story, that's simply that. It's the origin. It's the thing that sparked you wanting to write a story. This isn't to say that we should never examine the things surrounding a book and how it came to be. I'm not saying it's this black and white situation, but I do, for the most part, try to base my thoughts on the works themselves. And so I do think this means, as I stated before, if something was originally fan fiction, got taken down from one of those sites, reworked, and then was traditionally published, but it still feels really similar, then we should feel free to comment on that and point out all the similarities, or point out the way that if you don't already have a working knowledge of whatever the source material was, then you're not going to be able to keep up, which that in and of itself is a problem too. I do think all of those sorts of things, we should be very comfortable about that, but I don't know that we should hold too strongly to marketing's presentation of the books. This is a whole, like I said, this could be a whole conversation in and of itself, and there are, I'm sure, other things about this that I'm not highlighting today. As I said before, I'll have the other video I did linked in case you'd like to see a little bit more about the process behind it. Another additional factor, and this will be the thing I end on before I switch over to the next point, is that I always want people to take chances, and I want people to push sometimes it's fun to take something familiar and then do something new with that thing that is familiar, or to do the familiar thing so well when it feels like nothing else is. So while that can still exist, I like when people take a chance and they are trying for something that's really creative and really different. And my fear is that if we're too comfortable writing things that are inspired by something else that is still in the zeitgeist, if you will, then we're not really pushing, we're just staying within. And then that can contribute to everything feeling the same, which is not, I don't think that's the best outcome out of all of this. Somewhat related to that, the next one from Elsa says, I really wish that publishing cared less about chasing trends and more about sharing great stories by authors who are so passionate about their works. I also want big publishers to allow proper time for editing and revisions. Good art takes time and patience. I wholeheartedly agree with that last part. Does anybody disagree with that last part? That's the thing. I feel like none of us do. Most of us, I think, are fully on board with things being properly edited. It's just so frustrating because I don't know what the solution is. This is the thing I always come back to of, well, what do we all just stop buying books, stop reading books until we've collectively deemed them properly edited? It's kind of hard to know, especially when a lot of the books that are really, really, really popular are the ones that feel like they're not as well edited. And then there's the question of sometimes those ones are profiting so much that actually is carrying the lesser known works, and that's what's allowing for publishers to take chances on those other ones. So it's almost like you have to feed the beast in order to provide something new also, which is kind of depressing to think about, but I don't really know what the solution is here. I know for myself, I also did a video about editing recently and publishing. And I'd mentioned that the book I had started, I actually DNF'd because I was like, and I was sent a finished copy of it. And I didn't complete that book, and I have yet to talk about that book. I probably will end up going back and reading it. And we will talk about that more. Some of you already know what book I had talked about in that video. Some of you don't, but maybe are curious. I will be eventually talking more about that, and this will be probably, unfortunately, I wish it wasn't, but it probably will be a continued topic of conversation. So I will be revisiting this. But yes, I also want them to have proper editing. And one thing I'll state is that after I made that editing video, I actually had an author message me and tell me that a lot of publishers are actually starting to have their editors more so freelance as opposed to in-house. And that's not a good sign. And this particular author was also saying they think that they're going to start having most of the editing be AI, which is also a terrifying and terrible thought. The first part, though, about you wish that they would stop chasing trends so much, I completely agree. This is the part that I said was kind of related to what I was saying, where I don't want there to be a hindrance upon creativity. I always want people to try something new, to take chances, or I don't really know how to describe this. There aren't any appropriate comp titles, but here's this idea I have. And I actually think we're starting to see this a little bit because we have gotten quite a few genre benders in this last year. Of course, we got a ton of books that just felt like we're spitting out a collection of tropes or it's on trend. But I do think that the genre bender is starting to present itself more often, at least in fantasy. I can't comment so much on other genres here, but that excites me. That tells me that maybe we are starting to branch out and look for things. I do want to note that while I don't like the idea of chasing trends whatsoever, I will, I suppose, talk about one positive, which is that it does sort of allow the genre as a whole, or whatever genre you want to think of here, it does allow for changes more quickly, which can be good or bad. So what I mean is that if we contrast this to fantasy from decades ago, fantasy, I think, sat in this very familiar place for a long time. Almost everything felt like it was inspired by Tolkien, or the people that directly were inspired by Tolkien, the authors that came after that were inspired by them. So you'll see this kind of, and I'm, of course, missing out on authors' apologies here, but for example, you'll have Tolkien and then Tad Williams, who was clearly inspired by Tolkien. And then Tad Williams' works were, it would seem, what inspired a lot of other authors like Robin Hobb, or George R. R. Martin even talked about how he really liked a lot of what Tad Williams was doing. A lot of readers like to point to the fact that George R. R. Martin said A Song of Ice and Fire was partially inspired by what Tad Williams was doing in Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. And then you also have Robert Jordan, who clearly a lot of the stuff that originally in the first book or the first few books was inspired by things that came before. So much so that a lot of it just felt the same. And if you look at when those books were published, we're spanning a pretty large amount of time. If you look at books that were published in the early 2000s and then the 2010s versus now, I think there has been a much bigger shift in what we have gotten, in the kinds of stories, the kinds of characters, the settings, the magic systems. I think there has been more variety than there was before. The downside, though, is that doesn't necessarily mean it's always the highest quality. Sometimes there'll be something that is different and unique, and then it just feels like publishing is trying to have lightning strike not just twice, but 1,000 times, because they just keep putting something out. Faye, for example, after, not that Sarah J. Maas invented Faye by any means, but after she really brought that a lot of popularity, then it felt like every story was a Faye story, and even though some of them were different from the kinds that Sarah J. Maas was writing, it felt like plenty were very similar. And so then it did kind of feel like we were stuck, but we kind of pushed past that a lot faster than we pushed past, I think, the Tolkien-esque style of fantasy that we got before. But as I said, it did result in a lot of things just feeling like copycats, and because of, going back to the editing, it doesn't feel like all of them are getting a lot of time to really develop. They all end up feeling like inferior copies. Maybe not all of them, that's an exaggeration, but some of them feel like inferior copies, as opposed to, oh, I liked this idea, and I actually think I would like it more if it was grimdark, Faye in a grimdark world, let's say, and somebody decided to write that, and then it was given a ton of time for editing, revisions, all those things that we want. And then when it was published, it's published years after, and it feels different enough, even though there are both, Faye exists in both of those things. Despite that, it feels like it stands on its own, and it's different, and it's its own story. So I do dislike the chasing trends, and I wish what we could do is combine the idea of, okay, it's good when a door is opened to a certain kind of story or a certain thing being explored in stories. That's good, but don't try to just make money off of it. Actually, be more thoughtful about the stories that you're putting out as a publisher. Actually, these two comments are back to back. Now switching to the next ones. I want my epic fantasy back. And then another one that says, I want more epic fantasy standalones. Not sure if you can call it a trend, but it should be one. And epic fantasy standalones are definitely few and far between, but I wouldn't mind more of that as well. I think the downside and why it almost feels like an oxymoron is because once it's so epic and you have this huge world and you have all of these characters, or the stakes are really high, you kind of are like, yeah, but I need to come back to this. You develop this whole thing, and then after one book is over. But I also think it's possible to accomplish that. I've tried to write out books that I would consider epic fantasy standalones, and I might still make a video. Let me know if you would like that. I'll have a pinned comment, and I'll say epic fantasy standalones video, ? And then you can let me know if you'd like to see that. And then also you can provide your own suggestions, so that if Joyce is looking to find some of those, then they can just look at your responses there. But as far as just the wanting epic fantasy back in general, this depends on what you're referring to, because I also want epic fantasy back, but I don't know that epic fantasy is as absent as maybe it feels like it is. It's not getting the backing by publishing, certainly on the level of things like the Fourth Wings of the world, but some of it exists. I often point to the Age of Uprising series by R.S. Ford as being epic fantasy, and there are a decent amount of self-pub authors that are writing epic fantasy, so obviously down there we have the Echoes saga, and I would consider, I think, Ascendant by Miller to be more epic. I have written some epic fantasy. I do think you have to search for it a little bit more. It's not as prevalent, unfortunately. But I'm with you. I love good epic fantasy, and I kind of think authors are just afraid to take that chance because epic fantasy takes so much time to develop and to build. And in the age of everything being super fast, whether it be TikTok videos that are super, super fast, or whether it be how we market books of just the trope marketing so that we give people just this snapshot, everything feels like that. Everything feels like a snapshot, and we have to constantly have everything being bright and vibrant and in your face and catching your attention right away. And sometimes we want to take a step back and we want to settle into this world and we want to allow it to expand and we want to feel transported, but that takes time, and I don't know if publishing wants to take chances on it, but I am with you. I wish it would. Next step, can we cut down on spice and instead focus on the swoon relationship building and maybe an actual plot outside of just smut every other page? I know what you mean when you say smut every other page, but I'm trying to think if I've ever picked up a book that is literally smut every other page. That would be so much. But I have picked up books where I'm like, this isn't really for me because it's mostly that. I personally also would love more of the emphasis on relationship building and the swooning and the will they, won't they, and the actual will they, won't they, where you're wondering and not it's marketed as will they, won't they, but you're like, well, obviously they will. That's what this whole story is. So I think there are different expectations depending on what we're going into. And I think my biggest thing is I just don't want to feel like I'm being lied to by what the marketing is saying. So if I'm picking up a fantasy romance, I recognize, or romantasy, whichever, I recognize that it is going to have a romance as the focus. I still think that what you're describing, Heather, can still exist. You can still have good relationship building. You can still have the swooning. I still want that to exist in those stories, but I don't have as much of a question as to whether they're going to end up together. It's more of like, how are they going to end up together? Or how are they going to work together to get through whatever they're going through, and then also maybe develop feelings along the way? How are they able to bond with each other? How are they able to have the trauma that they've experienced in the past? How are they able to communicate through that and help each other move forward? And anyway, I think a lot of what you're describing, I want to. I just don't like when things are presented as like enemies to lovers or slow burn. And you're like, slow burn? They get together in the first 50 pages. How is this slow burn? So I just don't want that. Now, as far as the actual really, really, really good relationship building, I feel like currently some of my absolute favorite couples in fiction are not in fantasy romance. Because, to the point that you were making at the end of your comment here, I do think there is a lot of emphasis on the more smutty material, and there's an audience for that. There is there's a place for it, but I do think that maybe we need to be more thoughtful about the inclusion of it in the same way. Sorry, I'm not trying to make an innuendo, but action scenes in books, like literal action, there's fighting or combat of some kind. Action scenes in books, not like characters getting some action. Action scenes in books. We obviously also don't want every other page of a book to be action scenes because you need the build-up. You need to be invested in the characters. You need to be invested in the stakes. You need to have a good understanding of the world and why this fight scene that's about to happen or whatever big thing is about to happen. You need to have a really firm grasp on everything, and you need to be emotionally invested so that when that scene comes up, you actually care about what's happening. So if we're going to have the smuttier moments in stories, I feel like it needs to be approached in a similar fashion. You also don't have to include it either. It's not like the only way that you can show the relationship between characters is to show those moments. But I do think that if you're going to include those things, if you don't have all the other stuff, it's not really feeling like there's a whole lot of a point to it. We finally have one that is positive. It says, I'm loving genre-bending fantasy, and they list a number of authors that have written genre benders, and some of the books, so for example, we have A Drop of Corruption, or The Shadow of the Leviathan is the series name. And then, of course, T. Kingfisher has written so many works that are genre blenders. A Sorceress Comes to Call is an example where it's kind of horror and fantasy. And then we also have the Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, which is fantasy, but it's also kind of contemporary, and it's a little bit of romance. So there definitely are ones that are genre benders. There are, of course, more than just the ones by the authors mentioned here, and I am in agreement. I also am loving the genre benders, and I want more of that. The next one, there are two different things mentioned. One, I know it'll never happen. Movies and TV have the same problem, but I wish publishing wouldn't chase trends so hard, something we talked about before. The minute X is successful, you know the next 2 to 5 years will be X, but Y, or X plus Z, and 99% of those will never be as good as X, and just because I left X doesn't mean I want every single book to be a riff on X. And the second point, there's a growing trend of authors writing in first-person present tense. This is the reason I had this, because obviously the first point we kind of already dove into, but this next point, the first-person present tense, it is so grating to my eyes and brain because no one would tell a story that way to another person unless you're a Twitch streamer actively narrating what you are doing. My friend Christy, who I saw, Christy, you also had a similar comment, and you said something like, other people have to also be frustrated with this or I'm dead, or something like that. We've talked about this before, and I remember, unless I'm mistaken, which is possible, but a random side note here. So I remember as a kid, this is super random, but my mom would often, when I was a kid, fall asleep in my room while watching the show Frasier. And then into adulthood, I ended up rewatching Frasier and appreciating a lot more of the jokes. But I remember really vividly, even as a kid, there was an episode of Frasier where Frasier is enamored with, if you've never watched Frasier, you don't need to know anything about it in order to know what I'm talking about here. But there's an episode where the character, Frasier, he is enamored with this man that Roz, his friend, had dated. And this guy just has all these cool stories, and he also goes out onto the sea often, and so he's just, Frasier's like, wow, this guy's so cool. And the guy talks about possibly writing his stories down one day, and Frasier is like, I'll help you write your stories. And he tells him to write it in present tense because it creates that feeling of you're right there alongside the character, and it heightens everything that's about to happen, and you feel way more edge of your seat. And I remember even when I was first starting to try to look into more about writing, that it was recommended that if you want if you want real human beings to be invested in what's happening with the characters, a little suggestion, try writing in present tense. And I remember being like, I don't like present tense as much. And it's just so interesting that that was recommended for a long time, and that I'm almost positive that even in the show Frasier, which the one thing I'll know about Frasier, if you don't know anything about it, is that they're really snobby people. So if even in Frasier they're saying it, I'm like, am I some plebeian for liking third person past tense? What? I don't understand. And I do think it's fair for people to have their preferences when it comes to the different kinds of tenses, whether it be third person present, that's not as common, but that does occur, present or third person past tense, or first person past or first person present tense, or second person. I'm not a fan of second person. I don't know that I want any author to feel like they have to write in a certain tense to tell their story, if that's not the voice that they feel like is best suited for the story they're trying to tell. So while I think it's totally fine, you have your preference, and I can agree that I don't want it to become a trend where then authors feel pressured or like publishers are insisting they change it. I don't want that to happen, but I also don't know if I'm of the mindset that it needs to go away in its entirety, because I think that there is intention, or there can be intention behind using different tenses, and they can serve different purposes. Now, your point about nobody tells a story that way. Well, I mean, some people do, because there's plenty of writing that exists that is told that way. But if you're meaning that human beings, typically, if we're engaging in oral tradition of storytelling, we don't tell stories that way. I guess I'll say that I think most books are not written in a way that is technically exactly like how we are in real life. For example, dialogue that sounds like how we actually talk is so cringy. It's so cringy. And I don't know how many of you have ever taken the time, maybe it's just because I talk to a camera and then I have to edit myself, and I'm always like, oh, I feel so stupid. I need to stop using these words all the time. And you start to pick up on certain cadences or your voice inflection, and you get all in your head about it. And you just can't help but notice how dumb you sound when you listen back to yourself. I don't know how many of you have actually ever practiced that, but you probably sound pretty stupid. Most of us sound pretty stupid on a regular basis when we're speaking casually to our friends. Obviously, if you're giving a presentation or something like that, it's a little more prepared. But most of us, off the cuff, sound pretty dumb. So my only thing is that I don't know that I need books to 100% represent how we actually are all the time. There are certain things that we recognize we probably don't have to insert for the sake of realism. I use dialogue as an example, but another example is that we don't typically go into detail about every time a person has a bodily function that they need to take care of, or every time their belly aches or something like that. We don't usually dive into all of those things, or the amount of times like an eyelash gets in your eye or something. We don't usually address all of those things. But again, I think it's completely fair if you don't really like first person present tense. Rose says, covers that all look the same. I know it's about marketing and making a unique cover is taking a risk, but I love it. I really like when covers just go for it. They take a chance. They're bold. Sometimes they're subtle and simple, and that's nice too. My big thing is I don't necessarily feel like a lot of covers these days match the book itself. To your point, it feels as though they're just trying to make something pretty, which I appreciate the artistry that goes behind making something that is pleasant to the eye. But I want it to be one of those things where once you read the story, you go back and you look at the cover, and then you start to notice details about it that stand out more because you've read the work, or covers that pull you in, or covers that make you ask questions. Am I still on occasion a sucker for just a pretty book that maybe doesn't say a whole lot? Yeah, on occasion I am, but I'm with you where so many covers, you could swap out the title and I would believe you that it was for that book. Trends to end. 1. Every book written by a woman being called romantasy. No, The Raven Scholar isn't romantasy. Why are people calling it so? 2. Fantasy publishers giving million-dollar deals to self-published authors and filling all the slots with republished romantasy instead of new titles. I have a feeling I know who you're referring to there, or at least maybe what sparked this. 3. Everything is a duology. Usually book 2 is unnecessary or the content is artificially stretched to fit 2 books, and book 1 ends in the middle of cliffhanger. And then 4, lack of editing, especially developmental editing. We've already addressed that last point, so I won't get into that one. The first point. I completely agree. This is the new YA, every woman who writes fantasy writes YA thing, except for instead of it being YA, now it is romantasy. And in The Raven Scholar specifically, I noted in my review for The Raven Scholar that it is not romantasy or fantasy romance. It's not. However, I do think it's written in a similar style, but that doesn't mean that it's romantasy. And there are other books that aren't even a little bit romantasy, and they're being called that. I remember seeing Robin Hobb, Farseer trilogy, was called fantasy romance at one point, and I was like, what? How? And being astounded because it's not true. And when I was saying it feels like the new YA women writing fantasy or just YA, this was a thing that happened before when YA was becoming a more formal age range that books were being sold within. Some books that were just fantasy before, that were written by women, were just being shelved as young adults. And I think that, of course, we should just look at what the material is within the book and then place things accordingly and not ask the question of like, but was it a man or a woman who wrote it? That shouldn't be the deciding factor. It's so stupid. So yes, I completely agree. And also as readers, we need to be mindful of, just because a woman is writing fantasy doesn't mean that it is going to be secretly a fantasy romance in disguise or anything like that. Ultimately, I feel like most of the blame when things get misconstrued is in how it's marketed. But I do think sometimes marketing is trying to do what they think is going to ultimately profit the most. And there have been instances in the past where some people don't want to pick up a book by a woman because I think I've mentioned this before, so I'm going to try to keep this brief. But way back when V.E. Schwab was publishing the book Gallant, This was the first time that she decided to have something that was technically YA fall under V.E. Schwab instead of Victoria Schwab, because in the past, she was advised by her publisher to use Victoria in her YA and younger works in general, but then for her adult works, she was advised to use her initials. A lot of female authors were advised to use their initials in the past because they had evidence that showed people were less likely to pick up a book in the adult fantasy section if it was a very overtly feminine name. So hence her using her initials there. When she wrote Gallant, there was a lot of confusion leading up to the release of Gallant because it said V.E. Schwab, so people were like, well, it must be adult. So she had a clarification saying, I am now just publishing everything as V.E. Schwab. It feels the most me, whatever her elaboration was. And so because I do anticipated releases videos, and that topic had come up, over on my community tab, I mentioned, oh, here's V.E. Schwab's explanation as to why she's using V.E. Schwab now for Gallant, and it would seem Gallant is indeed a YA book. And there was a response that said something like, this is all made up by publishers for women to feel persecuted, or something like that. There was somebody like going off about how that's not even real. And then the next comment right after that was somebody like, I don't want to read books by women because they just write girly stuff. And I was like, okay, you two need to talk to each other. And then you have games like Ghost of Yote, by Sucker Punch that I've had a lot of fun playing, and also listening to the soundtrack too. If you haven't had a chance, you should listen to the soundtrack to Ghost of Yote. It's incredible. But anyway, point is, the lead up to Ghost of Yote, I don't feel like any normal serious gamer cared at all, but there was this big hoopla because, what? The main character is a woman? No, unless it looks like Eve from Stellar Blade, you're not allowed to have a woman as a protagonist because I can't imagine myself as a lady. And there's like all this ridiculous nonsense that nobody who's a grown adult took seriously. But there's this huge thing that was so silly. And anyway, coming back to this, I just think it is really unfortunate that whether an author is a man or a woman, marketing seems to feel the need, or even sometimes readers feel the need to put them in certain boxes and pigeonhole them, returning to my idea about how I want authors to always feel like they have free reign to explore their creativity and tell the stories they want to tell. I just think the more that we put them in boxes, the more we are doing a disservice to them, to ourselves, and to what fiction can be. Your second point about feeling like we're giving millions of dollars to people that were previously self-published, but they were already really successful and they're primarily romantasy. I, in the past, was really excited when I would see a self-pub work getting picked up because it was an opportunity for somebody who more than likely had probably not made that much money. In fact, they might have even been in the hole when it came to exploring their writing careers as self-published or indie authors. It was exciting to see, okay, this is maybe an opportunity for more readers to find them and for them to actually be able to make writing their career. Because for a lot of self-pub authors, they still have to do their day jobs. They're probably not making that much money, and they're doing so much in their spare time to try and tell stories that a lot of us are grateful for because they are going outside a lot of what we've talked about today, the trope marketing and the trends and those sorts of things. But to your point, it feels like the authors who are incredibly successful are the ones that traditional publishers are like, I want to make the money off of that. And then they sign them. And then, yeah, those authors do probably get boosts in their career, but it's not quite the same. And also there are a lot of other authors who are querying and who are trying to get their foot in the door, and they're not given that opportunity. Sometimes proving yourselves these days just comes down to, do you have a big TikTok following? Do you have a big YouTube following? And it's less about the quality of the work, it's less about how innovative it is, it's less about how intriguing the story is or how great the themes are explored. It's less about that, and it's more just about, are you a popular person? Well, let's back you. I don't want to put the blame on the authors who are successful already before they've been picked up. I think that the main culprit here is the publisher, and just them always looking to, it feels like, almost always looking to try and squeeze the most out of everything they possibly can, make the most amount of money, and it's less about telling phenomenal stories. I maybe would be more willing to give them some grace if I wasn't seeing them lean further into AI, if I wasn't seeing them treat their employees poorly, their editors, the people that do the marketing. A lot of times the people that do the marketing, they're trying their best, but they have someone above them telling them they have to do something a certain way. So a lot of the people that are making the big decisions at the end of the day are the ones that I'm the most frustrated with. I do have a side note, by the way. I've thought about making an entire video about this, but I don't want it to come across like I'm throwing shade to anybody. But does anybody else have some mixed feelings about successful authors not even publishing new works on Kickstarter, but republishing older works on Kickstarter? Does anybody feel like this is getting a little, I don't know, it feels like it's taking away the outlet that lesser known creatives have to try and finance their own works. I don't know anything about Dungeon Crawler Carl, but I did see people talking about how it was like one of the most backed Kickstarters ever. Isn't that already really successful? Are we just, I don't know all the details, so if I'm wrong here, feel free to correct me. But I was like, it's not like a new work, right? It's not like a cool, partially traditionally published, partially indie setup, because there are authors that do that, and I actually think that's really cool. I don't think that's what's happening. I think we're doing a Kickstarter campaign for a series that's already mega successful, and that feels different than what it feels like Kickstarter is for, and thus saying like, oh my gosh, it's the biggest backed thing ever. I'm kind of like, well, I mean, it's already really well known. It's not like some unknown managed to get a lot of wind in their sails or something. Maybe this is a conversation for another day, but your point here reminded me of it. Now, as far as everything's a duology, I don't know if I think there are that many duologies. I do think that we should, or authors should ask the question of what is the amount of time that this story needs, and I think publishers should also ask that question instead of trying to maybe fit something into, oh, we can stretch this out and actually make it 2 books and we'll make more money that way. I hope it's not that disingenuous of an approach. As far as book 1 ends in the middle of nowhere on a cliffhanger, if you mean like it literally, like I think the Strange the Dreamer duology has had this accusation thrown at it. I don't know that I entirely agree. I don't mind cliffhangers personally, but if it feels like literally the book out of nowhere just stopped just so that we could publish a second book, and you easily could have made it 1, I get what you're saying. I think in that book's case, while it does feel like you literally just walked us off a cliff, there are a lot of things that get introduced in the second book, and there's a big shift that I think it makes sense to kind of have a more formal separation. But I completely see where you're coming from, though, where it can just feel like we only just stopped it just so that we could have a second book. You had trends that you thought should stay, so those were the ones you didn't like. Trends that you want to stay: diverse romantasy, black, sapphic, etc. Especially love the rise of bi characters in male-female romantasy. 2, shorter books. I love seeing so many fantasy books under 500 pages. 3, happy endings guaranteed genres like cozy and romantasy. Grimdark is fine, but not for me. I enjoy the everything will be well genres. And then 4, books with religious themes: gods, angels, demons, priests, nuns, paladins, etc. I do also like that we are getting a little bit more of the acceptance for happy works. I think that's ultimately a good thing. I love a good sad book. If you tell me, oh my gosh, this book made me cry, I can't get over this book, that is going to pique my interest, certainly. But I do think there's something to, nothing makes me happier than this story. I just think this is so precious, it's so wholesome, and sometimes we need that too. It's not, well, actually, it is technically a book, but I was going to say something like Kiki's Delivery Service. Studio Ghibli has the movie, and I have read the book, and it's precious. But sometimes I'm like, I kind of just want to watch Kiki's Delivery Service. It's just so cute. You know, like sometimes you have those moments, and I think that that's great. And then sometimes you're like, I need to be put through it. And like you said, Grimdark's not necessarily for you. It's fine, but you're happy that there is a wide range. And I think that's ultimately where I land as well. I don't like when it feels like one group of stories dominates and then it feels like we have no space for other kinds. I think it's important to have different kinds. Shorter books, once again, whatever the amount of time is that the book needs is what I want the book to have. And if that's a shorter amount, I think that's great. If it needs more, I think that's great too. Whatever, as long as we're not, it feels like chopping a bunch and then the story is bare bones and it's bad, or we feel like we have to expand it I don't think that either option is great, whatever the story needs. I also really like that we're getting more diversity. In fact, I would say some of the maybe more contemporary romance than romancy. I'd have to take a look. But I feel like some of the ones I end up liking the most are the ones that aren't just... Because I feel like a lot of the just basic guy and gal is... It even has its own box that it's like, he's massive and angry and he is going to burn the world down, except for her. He, like, loves her so much. But sometimes he can be, like, really jealous and sort of possessive and ultimately not that great either when it comes to how he treats her. Or he's a complete doormat. It's one of the two. And then she's, like, a strong female character who is actually just really stupid. And you're like, that doesn't mean she's strong. And it just feels like the same exact couple over and over again. So I like that we are starting to have more of a mix. And then your last point about books with religious themes. I feel like there was a time when we were getting a lot of that. You had the Demon Hunter type of books. And I do feel like that fell off, and it seems like it's starting to pop up again. So that is exciting. Like anything, though, we just don't want it to become a trend that we just copy-paste. All right, we talked about that before. Next up, this is a little bit of a longer one. I like the trend of both content creators and readers encouraging people to make their own opinions on works. Building on this, I'd like to see more people consider each work in a genre individually versus tossing them all together. Example, I like this romantasy book, but not this one, versus I don't like any romantasy books. I think it's impossible to not like any book in an entire genre. It's too broad of a category. I don't like most sports books and movies, but even I have found several that I love. Each book should individually be given a chance because genre categories are just the best approximation we can make for a very subjective piece of art or pieces of art. I could not agree more. I recognize a lot of people, they are talking in the way that they would talk to a friend or a family member. And so when they're speaking very casually, they will be like, I don't really like romantasy, or I don't really like fantasy books, or I don't really like mysteries and thrillers. They'll say things like that. And if you know the person, you know that they are fully aware, like, well, I might like some, but they don't feel the need to qualify that. And I have seen a push of people in general feeling like they shouldn't have to qualify everything they're saying with, well, there are exceptions, of course, because they feel as though it's a disingenuous way of presenting yourself, or it is feeling like it's bogged down. You can't just speak like a normal person because you have to add these qualifications. And I understand where people are coming from, but I guess I have a little bit of pushback, and it is tied to what you're talking about here. I don't think it's that hard to change. I don't really like romantasy books. I don't think it's that hard if you are somebody who's like fully aware that there might be some that you like, to say, I haven't found a romantasy book I've liked this far, but I'd be willing to try other ones. It's not that hard to change how you say it. It's not like it has to be this over the top. Now, let me just be clear. I'm not saying that like all of them are bad. It's just the ones that I've encountered. You don't have to be proclaiming so dramatically in order to make the point very clear. Also, even though I talked about before, when I'm editing, I'll hear certain things and I'll be like, oh, I'm so tired of hearing myself say that over and over and over again. I do, and I made an effort from a pretty young age to incorporate into how I speak, saying, I feel as though, or I feel like, or in my opinion. I do actually prefer to have those qualifiers when I'm speaking, because I think that the opposite is actually worse. When people speak as though they have authority on something, or their opinions are the authority, I don't personally think that's the best direction to go down. I think it is better to have a little bit more of a, this is my opinion, this is how I feel. Like you said, these are just approximations for subjective pieces of art, and it's good for us to recognize that and reinforce that as much as possible. And if there's just a simple way to incorporate certain phrases into how you speak that articulates that without feeling the need to be like, now everybody, just to be clear, every single time I talk about a book, just to be clear, these are my opinions on this book, just to be clear. You don't have to do that every time. You can just say, this didn't really work for me, this is why it didn't work for me. You can say things like that, those sorts of phrases that make the point very clear. And also, I'll add that the idea of, I don't want to have to qualify everything I'm saying because that's not totally natural. It is not natural to talk into a camera and then edit yourself and then upload that. You are literally not talking in a normal way. You're talking to yourself. So if you have to maybe slightly polish how you talk, because you are going to be presenting this to a huge collection of people. For me, I'm like, it's not that hard to err on the side of clarity. It's really not. Sorry, there's a fuzz. On occasion, you're still going to say something that it didn't come out the way you meant it. Or there are still going to be people that no matter how many times that you try to be as clear as possible, there are people that are just purposefully obtuse, or they're just maybe kind of stupid. Or there are people that are going to misunderstand what you were saying. Or there are people that actively are trying to take what somebody is saying in bad faith. All that said, the idea of just being able to say, a lot of these genres don't really work for me because of XYZ, but I did like this one. This one I really liked, and here's why. I completely agree. I feel like that needs to be something that a lot of us get more in the habit of practicing, and it would clear up so much of what can come across as superiority, or even almost infantilizing people for what they do like, or being condescending to other people for liking different things than you. And to your point about encouraging more people to vocalize their individual opinions. I have said so many times that the reason I don't like looking at reviews before I pick up books is because I don't like having outside influences. I, one, want to, as much as possible, eliminate the chance of what I call intellectual plagiarism, where I see somebody else's opinions on something, and then, even if I don't mean to, if I kind of soak that up and then present it as my own, I don't feel like that's fair, that somebody else's opinions, and especially when there is AdSense, so literally there is the opportunity to make money off of how you are processing the story, how you are relaying that information to other people, how you personally interpreted it. I don't think it's fair for me to just basically accidentally adopt somebody else's thoughts and then present those and then make money off of it. I don't think that's fair. And then second, which I don't do this, but if you are purposefully doing it where you're trying to represent it as your own, then that's absolutely not okay. And then I also would say that I think there are individuals who are nervous to express an opinion that is a little bit different than a lot of other people's, or even some people are afraid to express an opinion that does match up with everyone else because they're afraid that in having the mainstream opinion that their audience will think that they're dumb or that they're a sellout or something like that. And always, like you're saying, people should just try to always be as honest as possible. I'm not a huge movie person, but I'm going to use a movie situation as an example. My husband does like a lot of movies, and he's way more in the know, and he tends to follow conversations around movies much more than I do. And the movie, I believe it's called Eddington. He was telling me that when he first was seeing that movie come out and he was seeing people talking about it, almost exclusively, everybody was hating on the movie. And then all of a sudden, as we've come up into 2026, all of a sudden, a bunch of people are now being like, Eddington's actually really good. And it was one or the other. And I think what happened possibly, because I've seen this occur many times in book spaces as well, or just any kind of media conversation, is that there is this initial feeling that people then feel like they have to partake within, like they're not allowed to have an opinion that differs because they're supposed to have the correct opinion. And then somebody finally, the dam breaks, somebody finally says, I maybe actually think differently. And then a bunch of other people are like, yeah, me too. Some people just kind of sat in the shadows and they did think differently, but they never wanted to say it because they were afraid to say otherwise. But then once they feel like not only somebody said it, but then they were met with positivity for saying a different opinion, then they feel like, oh, okay, well, I can say it now too. Or some people will retract what they said before and they'll soften it and they'll change it slightly. And it feels like it's because they're like, well, I mean, I want to be known to have the correct opinion, so I am going to slightly shift on over here. That bums me out when I see that occurring. I'm sure you can think of examples of this happening in book spaces as well. There are probably certain stories that you can even point to specific books or specific series. And actually, I'm very curious. If you can think of this happening, feel free to mention when that's occurred. But I just always want people to thoughtfully engage in the stories that they're picking up, and when they're having conversations about these stories, to be honest about how they feel. Now, I do want to state that it is okay sometimes for people to leave their opinions outside of it if they're just trying to inform people about what a book is about. That's obviously a different way of presenting the information than if you're genuinely talking about what you thought of it. But I do think that if you are talking about and you're presenting it as, here are my thoughts about this book, and you aren't authentic, that is not the best approach. And then last for today, this is one I've seen come up many times, and I enjoyed, Alex, your exasperation about this. Please stop. Female main characters who are 5 feet tall and male main characters who are 6'4". Where are all the characters between 5'7" and 5'11"? As a woman who is 5'9", I get so excited when I read a tall female main character, even more so if she's shorter than 6 feet. Because no offense meant, when I read something with a 6-foot woman, she's usually the big buff badass warrior woman, which is awesome, but still, not every tall woman needs to be a warrior. I'd love to see female main characters who are just taller than the average, and male main characters who are actually just average height, 5'8" to 5'10". I know this has been a trend for years, but it drives me nuts. I really enjoyed the little tiny mini rant that you went on for this, and I don't disagree. I don't mind the small lady and the tall fella. I don't mind that. But I agree that we need more when it comes to the heights of the characters, and especially if we're talking about characters in relationships with each other, it always feels like it's what you're describing, where it is the tiny girl and the big guy. Tiny woman. I should get out of that habit. But it is strange how it feels like there's nobody that's just a normal height. Everybody's either massive or tiny, and normal people don't exist, I guess, is what I'm discovering here. That's it though for some trends from 2025 that you would like to see die, or as this last one pointed out, trends that have existed for a while, but you still wouldn't mind if they would leave already. And then some trends that you've been enjoying. If you'd like to expand on anything that was discussed today, feel free to expand on that. If you want to add other trends that you didn't really love so much, feel free to talk about that as well. And then if you have any suggestions for this style of video, any talking points that you would like to see elaborated on, or just ideas that you feel like this would be a fun discussion, feel free to leave those as well. I've done a whole series of videos that I have called From Readers, and I will have that linked, as well as videos that are specific to trends, book talk, those sorts of things. So I'll have those playlists linked in case you'd like to see more videos in this style. But thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.